Hey everyone, I told you I was going to do it yesterday, and now today I'm bringing it to you. Creepypasta Storytime Episode 7, The Slenderman. Now, I did some digging, and I found out that there's a lot more stories than this one, but I just want to read one of them. Maybe somewhere down the line I'll go back onto the page that I found multiple different stories to read. But I just want to read like the original first. So this came out January 14th, 2010, which was a year right after the Slender Man even existed through a Photoshop competition, but people are saying that he actually existed long before that. It says the estimated reading time for this is 3 minutes, so if it actually takes us a short amount of time, I'll do what I did yesterday. Actually, no. Since I did find more Slenderman stories, and if this story only does take 3 minutes or less, I will pause and go onto that website and basically pick out one of the Slenderman stories. So let's begin. After waking up with a jolt, the girl laid in bed a few seconds longer, reaching over to switch on her bedside lamp. She tried to remember exactly what had stolen her sweet slumber away. When she couldn't, the brunette swung her legs over the side of the bed and heaved herself up. Checking the time on the phone, she snorted when she saw it was midnight, the witching hour. Knowing that sleep would only evade her, she left her bedroom for the kitchen, a good cup of coffee on her mind. As she passed by the door, a chill spread like liquid fire down her spine. It's only winter, she told herself, focusing again on the coffee plan. Measuring out scoops, water, and preparing her cup kept her occupied. But as the dark liquid boiled, she had nothing left to keep her mind from wandering off. The chill returned, and she couldn't help but glance behind her to the front door. It stood there innocently enough, just like always. The deadbolt was still in place, and she could see nothing amiss with it. Turning back to her coffee, she did her best to forget about the feeling. With her cup in her hand, she started back towards her bedroom. As she walked by the front door, she decided that a quick glance out of the people would help calm her restless mind. The chill worsened, and with each step she took towards the door and further away from the safety and warmth of her blankets, she pressed her empty hand against the cold metal door and took a deep breath before leading her eye to the peephole. At first she could only see an inky blackness and somehow seemed to swirl in itself. When she blinked in surprise, the void melted away. She wished it hadn't. In its place there stood what she could only guess was once a man. The limbs were long and inhumanly awkward, with bulky joints branching off into several arms. Not unlike the branches of a tree, the creature was draped in a black suit, somehow making the thing more nightmarish to her. The icing on the proverbial cake, however, was that passed as the hellish thing's face. It was though as her mind blurred the ghastly visions to spare itself further shock and horror. She shoved herself away from the door with the hand still pressed against it. The scalding mug of coffee fell, the liquid burning her bare leg as she fell backwards and tried to crawl away from the door. She knew somehow that her mind hadn't been playing tricks on her. As she crab-walked away from the door, she watched tendrils as black as the void she first saw snake around through the cracks. The girl was trapped between the instinct to flee and the gut feeling to not turn her back on the door. When the door jolted, the urge to flee overcame her, and she slipped in the burning liquid as she tried to make it back to her room. She knew deep down that she was trapping herself in a corner, but she had to get away from the door. The girl was halfway down the hallway when she heard the previously locked door creak open. She screamed and slipped into a wall, cracking her chin on it and stunning her. After that, there was only blackness. "Nicole?" A warm male voice snapped the woman out of her trance. As she turned around, she was met by one of her sister's doctors. She nodded, not sure if she could say anything or even if she could find her voice if she did have something to say. That morning she had gotten an urgent phone call from the hospital saying her sister Lindsay was there. Before they'd even let her see her, the doctors had pulled her off to the side and insisted that they talk to her about what might have happened. Phrases like self-inflicted and assault had been thrown around, and Nicole felt her mind reel. fully understood what they had been saying until she saw Lindsay with her own eyes. Her little sister had a bandage wrapped around her head, covering both her ears as well as her eyes. They said it was to keep her now deadened eyes from drying out and to try to keep infection out of the wounds Lindsay had made to her ears. The doctors had guessed that either she or someone else had jammed a pencil into them to keep her off balance, or to deafen herself against something. There was the mix of first and second degree burns on her hands, legs, and feet, from what was assumed to be the coffee her neighbors found slipped all over the entry to her apartment. As Nicole walked into her sister's hospital room the first time, she spied the silhouette of a man in the window. That she knew was impossible. Her sister's room was on the third story of the hospital. Well, actually, it looks like that they've got two other stories. Let's check out this one. I mean, I'm not going to do any special episodes just yet, but okay, guys, hang on. I'm actually going to go on that website and pick one of those stories. Okay, so for the second story, we are going to be reading The Slenderman Cometh. I once lived a normal life. I was a groundskeeper at a local cemetery. It wasn't the best job, but hey, it paid the bills. I lived alone in an apartment complex that stood about a mile from the cemetery in which I worked. I would spend my time writing short stories about my boring life and the days I spent at the cemetery. When I worked, it was usually during the afternoon into twilight hours. I never would have worked at night. That place is creepy as it is, thank you very much. I stayed far away from it during the night. It was always the same routine. Show up at the cemetery, gather my tools, and go out to pick up trash and tidy up gravestones until it started to get dark. Then go home and do whatever, nothing special. This routine continued for a year and a half, ever since the day I got the job. Not once did I ever run into anything spooky, like you'd see in a cheesy horror movie. There were never any black cats or curses, and certainly no zombies crawling out of the ground to eat my brains. However, there was one day that would change my life forever. The day I saw him, or rather it. The day I saw the Slender Man. It started off like any other day. I walked to the cemetery, got my tools, and headed out to pick up the trash. But something felt different that day. It was hard to explain, but I felt as though I was being watched. I would constantly look around nervously, only to find that there was nothing around. The only sounds I heard were birds chirping in the trees and the occasional car that passed by. So I spent the entire day on edge, something in the back of my mind telling me that there was something else with me in that cemetery. At the end of my shift, as I headed back to put my tools away for the night, I noticed that the birds were gone, and there were no cars passing by anymore. Everything was eerily quiet. Just then I saw what appeared to be a man standing about 100 feet from me. From what I could see, he was abnormally tall and wore a black suit jacket with a white shirt and black tie. Because it was beginning to get dark, I couldn't see his face very well, so I couldn't tell if he was anyone familiar. I called out to him, but he didn't move. He just stood there like a statue. I began to walk towards him, accidentally dropping my tools along the way. I bent down to pick them up, and when I looked to where the man was, he was gone. There was no sign of him anywhere. I scratched my head and shook it off, thinking I was just seeing things because I was overworked. I put my tools away and headed home, but I walked a little quicker than usual. I was still a little nervous and questions filled my head. Who was that man? Why did he just stand there, and how did he disappear so quickly? Was he real, or just a figment of my imagination? That night I barely slept at all. It was my thoughts that caused my insomnia. The next day at the cemetery I was even more tense. I felt like if a leaf were to fall on my head I'd scream in terror. The more distracted I got from my work. Soon enough my boss Jeff came out to talk to me. Jeff was a good guy. He and my father went way back, and he was the one who gave me the job as groundskeeper in the first place. He and I were also good friends, and he knew that I wasn't acting myself that day. "Stephen, what's the matter?" he asked me. "You seem a little off today. Something wrong?" I didn't want to sound like a crazy person, but I knew I could never lie to Jeff, so I told him the truth. I saw something yesterday, Jeff. There's a man in a suit that was just standing in the cemetery. He didn't do anything, and then he just disappeared out of nowhere. It kind of freaked me out. Jeff looked at me like I was crazy. Wait, what did you say this man looked like? I was surprised that he actually somewhat believed my story. He was really tall with a nice suit on. It was too dark so I couldn't see his face. Jeff rubbed his head and sighed. I don't believe it. I rolled my eyes thinking that he was talking about my story, but then he continued. I didn't think the legends were true, but what you've explained to me, Stephen, verifies that maybe the Slender Man does exist. Now I was the one that was confused. Slender Man? What's a Slender Man? I'm not the one you should be asking these questions, Steve. I only know a little bit about him, but I have a friend, James. He knows everything there is to know about the Slender Man. He took out a piece of paper and a pencil and scribbled something down, handing it to me. He said, "This is where give him a call and tell him what you saw and that you're coming to learn more about Slender Man. Any questions you may have, he'll answer them." I still thought the idea was a little crazy, but I wanted to know exactly what this Slender Man was. That night I did as Jeff suggested and paid a visit to his friend James. As I entered his house, I saw he was already seated at a table with pictures scattered all around. When I walked through the door, James greeted me with a smile. "Ah, Stephen, Jeff told me you were coming. Please, take a seat." I pulled up a chair to the table and began to observe some of the pictures he had laid out. "Jeff told me that you think you saw the Slender Man and that you want more info on him. Well, you've come to the right place." I nodded and he began to tell me everything he knew. "One thing you should know about the Slender Man, he is not human," James began. "We don't know what he is exactly, but we know for sure he isn't human. People who have seen him just describe him as you saw him, but he is sometimes seen with black tentacles emerging from his back. He is a fearsome creature and kills almost likely for the fun of it. Now let me give you a little backstory on the Slender Man. One of the first recorded instances of him was back in the mid-1500s in Germany. A woodcut artist by the name of Hans Freckenberg created a piece that displayed a creature that looks not unlike the Slender Man. It was discovered in Hausberg Castle in 1883. Here's what it looks like. He slid one of the pictures one that depicted a knight dueling with a strange humanoid creature with multiple arms and legs. James continued, "Now, Hans Freckenberg was known for his realistic depiction of human anatomy. But as you can see in that work, the character on the right has multiple arms and an oddly shaped face. This work differs greatly from all his other works. I was intrigued at the amount of knowledge that James had. But he wasn't quite finished. He slid another picture over to me. This one showed several children frolicking on a playground. Nothing out of the ordinary, except for the fact that a man that looked exactly like the one I saw in the cemetery was standing ominously in the background. Looking at that picture caused chills to race down my spine. Now, this here is the first recorded photograph of the Slender Man. You can just see him in the background. According to records, every single child in that photograph disappeared shortly after it was taken. They haven't been seen since. I was astonished. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. James then passed me a few more modern-looking pictures. Each one seemed like a normal everyday nature or family photo. But in the background of every one, the same tall man can be seen looming in the shadows." "That's pretty much all you need to know," James concluded. "Any questions?" I shook my head, still trying to wrap my head around why this thing was looking at me the day I saw him. "The Slender Man is a mysterious force, Stephen," James told me. "Nobody knows exactly why he does the things he does. Whether he does it for sport or he is a pawn for some higher being, we'll never know." Coming to this realization, I knew that I had to do something. I decided that the next day I would find the Slender Man and see for myself what kind of monster he was. I figured he was probably still in the vicinity of the cemetery, so I would hopefully find and capture him. "I wouldn't try that if I were you," James warned. "The Slender Man has powers that you wouldn't believe. It's best to let nature take its course, and whatever you do, don't try to approach him if you see him." I assured James that I would do no such thing and thanked him for all the information as I left. However, I was still content on attempting to end the Slenderman's reign of terror once and for all. See, let me stop right there. That's a little example. This Steven, he wants to try and capture the Slenderman or just take him down head on. Which everyone knows that if you've known Slenderman for the longest time, that he can teleport and he has those tentacles coming out of his back. So basically he can impale you easily. And then Steven tells James that he's not going to do it. But I know this so well that it's an example of when they say they're not going to do something, but then they still do it. Like that's like in one of the Sonic.exe stories, the friend sent the game to the protagonist in the story and told him do not play it to break the disc, to break Sonic's curse. But the dude decided to play the game anyway and has been haunted by Sonic ever since. But let's continue on. I worked through the next day like it was any other day, but I had my guard up the whole time looking for any signs of the Slenderman. There was no sign of him for the entire day. Once my shift was over, I put away my tools except for a flashlight and headed over to where I saw him standing just a couple days prior. Like that fateful day, everything was eerily quiet. No birds or cars made any sound. I could sense he was nearby. I approached the area where I first saw him and sat on one of the gravestones waiting. I knew he would come eventually. Excuse me. After about 20 minutes, I began to give up hope, until I heard rustling coming from the woods that surrounded the cemetery. It was beginning to get darker, and I got a little nervous. I had never been in that area when it was that dark before. It was almost pitch black now, and I only had the full moon and my flashlight for light. I gathered up some confidence and walked into the woods, my flashlight shining through the darkness. I followed the rustling sound through the woods, and it began to get louder and louder. It grew closer and closer, and my heart began to race. Sweat formed on my brow, and my hands shook as I tried to hold the flashlight steady. "Show yourself," I ordered as loudly as I could. Suddenly, from out of the brush of the woods came a squirrel. I let out a deep sigh of relief as the squirrel just stared at me for a few seconds. Then it took off running away from me. I thought nothing of it. It was a squirrel after all. They're usually afraid of their own shadow. I turned around and it felt like I walked into a brick wall. Damn it. I fell hard to the ground and dropped my flashlight. I couldn't see much, but I could see the outline of a figure illuminated by the full moon. I stumbled around like a madman, grabbing for the flashlight. I found it and shined it at the figure. I started at its legs and moved the light up to its body. When I hit its torso, I saw that it was wearing a suit and tie. I swear I felt my heart stop for a moment. I shined the light up and at its face and gasped in horror at what I saw. This creature had no face. It looked like an empty canvas. No hair, no face, no nothing. Just a pale white head looking down at me as if it knew I was there. He must have been at least 9 or 10 feet tall. I stumbled to my feet and felt 2 hands grasp my neck. I began to panic as my heart raced faster and faster, my breathing getting heavy. The creature pulled me closer and raised me up so my head was level with his. I stared into where his face should have been, and he tilted his head as if he were observing me. I could barely breathe as his grasp grew tighter around my neck. I struggled furiously, and suddenly several black tentacles emerged from the creature's back. I knew this was the end. I was about to become another victim of the Slenderman. However, I heard a faint bark of dogs and a few men calling my name. The creature turned his head towards the noise and then back to me. He took the raised tentacle and wrapped it around my forearm. A burning pain shot through my entire arm and I winced in pain. As if that thing's hands had been cutting off my air supply, I would have screamed bloody murder. The pain was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. The creature dropped me to the ground and stood above me for a few seconds. I looked up to it and I swear he nodded to me before fading into the surrounding darkness. I gasped for breath as the men found me. Jeff was with them. "Steven, what the hell happened here? We heard you yelling, so we came to find out what was wrong." With what little energy I had left, I let out a whisper, barely audible. It was the Slender Man. Then everything went black. When I awoke, I found myself in a hospital bed, my neck and forearm still in pain. Once I had regained complete consciousness, I looked down at my forearm and saw that there was a black mark where the Slender Man had wrapped his tentacle around me. I stared at it for a few minutes, trying to contemplate why it had spared my life and left me with just a black mark. Before I had a chance to think anymore, Jeff and James came into my room, Jeff carrying my laptop. "How are you feeling, Steve?" Jeff asked me. "Still in a little bit of pain," I replied. "The doctor said it should be out in a couple days, maybe even tomorrow." "I warned you not to approach him," James shook his head. "I figured he would be a little upset with me." "I know, I really wish I had listened to you." I apologized. He put his hand on my shoulder in comfort. "It's all right. I know how you feel. You wanted to get up close and personal view of the Slender Man. Who wouldn't? I'm just surprised he let you live." I was just as surprised. Had it not been for the men calling my name, I probably wouldn't have gotten so lucky. Soon later, Jeff handed me my laptop. "Why'd you bring this?" I asked him. "Because you need to tell your story," he replied. "The story how you met and survived the Slender Man. I'm sure a lot of people are going to want to hear about it." "But who is to say anyone will believe it?" I asked skeptically. James smiled and put his hand on my shoulder. "Stephen, for every skeptic there is a believer. I'm sure someone out there will believe it. Hell, maybe even there's someone who's had an experience just like yours. Now get some rest before you start writing. You need it." The two started to walk away until I called to them. "Hey guys, why do you think he left me with this?" I showed them the black mark on my arm, and James rubbed his chin. "No idea. I never heard of any reported cases of that happening. Maybe since you were lucky enough to survive, he gave it to you as something to remember him by." He smiled, and the two walked out of my room. I chuckled to myself as I thought, but then I realized that maybe that wasn't so crazy of an idea after all. I opened my laptop and began writing the story. My story. The story of my experience with the Slender Man. If I learned anything from that ordeal, is that when we may never know who or what the Slender Man is exactly, and where he's going to show up next, but I give this warning to you, dear reader. Beware the Slender Man, for the Slender Man watches us all. Okay, so the second story was way longer than the first one, so I think that was actually a real treat to show you guys, or read to you guys. But I could not do this Creepypasta story series without doing the Slender Man, because I thought that I couldn't do it without doing Jeff the Killer, so I ended up doing his story for episode 2. Eventually, I'm going to try and do the Smile Dog story, because everyone knows about his story, about how there's a haunted floppy disk that has that picture of him that is said that he's going to get in your nightmares and it's going to tell you to spread the word and all that. But, so, I don't know what I'll do for episode 8, but I will try and do the Smile Dog story eventually. I was going to try and do it for the past episodes, but due to some time and I wasn't able to get it, I had a tight schedule on the day of recording, so I wasn't able to do that. So that's how you guys got Candle Cove and The Rake yesterday. And so today you're going to get Slenderman with extra story, The Slenderman Cometh. So thank you guys for listening to this episode of Creepypasta Storytime. Thank you guys for watching. Smash the like button and comment down below who you want me to read about next. And if you want to check out my previous videos, I will leave a link down in the description below. So thank you guys for watching Creepypasta Storytime Episode 7, The Slenderman with extra story, The Slenderman Cometh. And thank you guys for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video.